So again, I'm Eric Towers. I'm the legal director here at the Law Center, and we've got Khadijah Williams, one of our board members and the chair of our strategic planning committee. We're moving into a part of the agenda a few minutes late, but we're going to catch up, I think. This part is called orientation to help us think about where we are and where we're going and how this conference, this National Forum on the Human Right to Housing, can help us get there. And this is a really special gathering for us. This is the first time that we've been, for many of us, to gather together with friends and partners in this movement since our lives were upended by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we had to cancel our 2020 conference, as Francine said. And, coming here, I was just thinking about what's happened since then. First, our country told everyone to stay at home to keep themselves safe from this unknown virus, knowing full well that millions of Americans have no home to stay in, and tens of millions more were threatened with imminent eviction due to their loss of income in the pandemic. But then, thanks to many of the people in this room, we took those stories of impact and we turned it into policy to prevent it from happening to others. We emphasize that when the ERs are full to bursting with COVID patients, if you want a bed or ventilator available when your family member needs one, you need to make sure it isn't already filled by somebody else when that could have been prevented. And in our case, that prevention looked like a nationwide eviction moratorium, billions of dollars in emergency rental assistance, a monthly child tax credit that helped people pay rent each month, guidance from the Centers for Disease Control to let encampments remain in place and provide them with sanitation unless people could be moved into non-congregate housing, and 100% reimbursement from FEMA to enable communities to make those non-congregate settings available. California created Project Room Key, which, while far from perfect, safely sheltered tens of thousands of unhoused persons through some of the most dangerous times of the pandemic, stabilized some of them for long enough to get into permanent housing, and we proved those who claim that many unhoused people are shelter resistant wrong. When people are offered individual rooms, dignified private space with a locking door in their own bathroom, the uptake rate was 95%. People want housing. And if you have to force them into a shelter or another encampment under threat of arrest, that says much more about what you're offering than their refusal to take it. And in some communities, we even saw them using the pandemic money to buy these hotels to make this non-congregate shelter interim housing situations permanent, as a permanent feature of their homeless service systems. And so for many of us, this was the first time that we had actually seen our country really mobilize on behalf of poor Americans, because for the first time in a long time, maybe since the Great Depression, there was a realization that we really were all in it together. And yes, there may have been some cynical self-interest about, I don't want that hospital bed filled when my grandmother needs it. But as far as policy goes, when we went up on Capitol Hill and said we need $40+ billion of emergency rental assistance, most of the time, we get used to hearing, we'll say that and they'll say, okay, we'll give you 5. But this time we got basically what we asked for. We got the full amount that we said this crisis required. And so to me, that felt like as close as we've been since FDR and the New Deal, and to policies that would be upholding housing as a human right, at least in the short term. And many of these policies came about because of the increased organizing for racial justice that came along with the other major upheaval since our last conference, our country's reckoning with racial discrimination in the wake of George Floyd's murder by the police. In Philadelphia, for example, the Black and Brown Workers Collective merged their racial justice protests with unhoused advocates and placed with an encampment right in the heart of Philly's Ben Franklin Parkway, and another in front of the Philadelphia Housing Authority. By acknowledging that housing justice is racial justice in a city and in a country where homelessness is disparately experienced by Black and Brown Americans at rates far exceeding the white population, encampment organizers leveraged far more power than homeless advocates working on their own outside of the racial justice context. And so ultimately, advocates were able to win the transfer of dozens of vacant city-owned properties into a community land trust to be used as housing for folks currently on the street and kept permanently affordable. This was the first time I had actually seen people being moved directly out of an encampment and into permanent housing, as a result of that advocacy. And I think there's a big lesson there for us as homeless advocates. Many of us have seen these sweeps of encampments and other homeless criminalizing policies implemented over all the very logical, good arguments that we make about their ineffectiveness or even their unconstitutionality. But if we lean into this racial justice analysis, if we build power together with racial justice organizers, then we're far stronger than we are as homeless advocates on our own. And that's not to say that we should ignore the legal advocacy. Obviously, since our last conference in 2019, actually the day before, we got confirmation from the Ninth Circuit that it would not be hearing the Martin versus Boise case en banc. And then after that, the Supreme Court declined to review the case. And so that decision has now stood for the past 3 years and has influenced policy from coast to coast. It's supported a growing number of other cases that have continued to clarify the ruling, led to settlements that have included housing and non-congregate shelter facilities, and served as the backdrop for an increased focus on housing and shelter in many other communities. And yes, many communities are still trying to find the barest minimum they can to legally comply with the ruling and then continue their criminalization policies. But it's set a new baseline and given advocates new tools, both on the inside and outside of the courtroom. And so for more on kind of where we're going with that, I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. As chair of the Law Center's Board Strategic Planning Committee, I also want to emphasize that this conference comes at a unique time for the Law Center. This is the Law Center's first conference since the retirement of its founding executive director, Maria Foscarinis. Since that time, we have brought in Antonia as our new executive director, undertaken significant racial equity trainings and conversations, begun implementing measures to ensure the board reflects the people the organization serves, and are currently gearing up for a major strategic planning effort to understand how we as an organization can best serve the field. And throughout this conference, we want to hear from all of you about what you think the Law Center does well and what you wish we were doing. Please find me or other board members or staff members and talk to us about what you need us to stop doing start doing in order to stop the criminalization of homelessness and make housing a human right for all people. We need all of you because, to be frank, we're in some serious shit right now. While Eric shared some of the good news that came out of the real short bipartisan emergency action during the pandemic that prevented a full-blown humanitarian disaster, we're now back to the status quo that allows housing to be held vacant for profit while millions have no home at all. And every day is a humanitarian disaster for them. More than half of the evictions in many places across the country are coming from corporate landlords, venture capital companies that bought up millions of units of housing during the foreclosure crisis and are now renting them out, building their rental contracts into new exotic financial packages and squeezing every last bit of profit out of them. And as of last night, the leading candidate for the Republican Party nomination for the presidency, Donald Damn Trump, has explicitly called for rounding up people living in encampments, forcing them under the threat of arrest into internment camps on the peripheries of our cities, supported by racist stereotypes segments on Fox News And the extremist so-called think tank, the Cicero Institute, is working in state legislatures across the country to introduce state-level bills to do the same. The threat isn't only from the political right, unfortunately. Where I grew up and experienced homelessness myself, in Los Angeles, California, in a blue city, in a blue state, city councilors, with the exception of Mike Bauman, who we're awarding later tonight, line up to support new criminalization ordinances despite the lack of available housing or even enough shelter. And the state just passed a new law, so-called care court system, that makes it easier to involuntarily commit people with mental illness who are experiencing homelessness. Those are the policies that could have pulled my family, my paranoid schizophrenic mom, and me and my little sister into the criminal justice system, preventing me from going to college and doing all the things I've done since. You know, like chair strategic planning committee. So I need all of the amazing folks in this room, all of you, to bring your best brains to this task. The task ending homelessness, obviously, and securing housing for all. The homelessness crisis has gotten so bad that people have lost their damn minds. They've lost their ability to see the humanity in those living on the street. They see only individuals responsible for living on the streets rather than the very systems that put them there in the first place. We have to stop this. We cannot fuck this up. We need your minds, your hearts, your hands, your feet, every damn thing to stop this. And you need to be focused on this one task for the next 2 days so that we can end homelessness and make housing a human right for all. Get started.
That's why we put her on the board. So thank you, Khadijah. And she mentioned doing this for the next 2 days. In fact, for some of us, this is going to be the next 4 days. After this forum, we're co-sponsoring our first ever vehicle residency summit together with Mr. Graham Pruse over there. And we've got already about 500 vehicle residents and other supporters who are going to gather online to better understand all these policies that impact vehicle residents and begin to craft alternatives themselves that will support their ability to survive and thrive despite the lack of a permanent home. And for those of us who want to join that, the registration is still open, vehicleresidency.org. Is that right? So please check it out.